friends, welcome back to the Wall Street Skinny. I'm Jen.
I'm Kristen.
And today we are going to be having our most exciting, longest awaited guest interview ever. Sarah was literally trained under John Nash at Princeton. If you haven't seen A Beautiful Mind, he's one of the most famous mathematicians of all time, very big in the field of game theory, which is so critical to investing and trading. But then she went on to be the chief scientist at NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And she is now global head of climate advisory at JPMorgan. For those of you who are going to be like, oh, climate, not for me. This sounds too political. Do not go anywhere.
Well, I think what really made this hit home was when she said, when she finished her PhD, because by the way, after she worked at Goldman Sachs, she'll talk about it, she then went back, got her PhD, and the people who came out of her PhD program all went to work for the Millenniums and the Citadels and the da-da-da-da. The reality is that there is so much money that can be made and lost by understanding this stuff. And so we get into the truth behind the investing. And I was sitting here initially thinking, and I said this to her, I was like, I thought this was going to be so boring. And meanwhile, I'm basically plotting to be like, can you please hire me? Because what you do sounds amazing. Like, I want to do that.
Yeah, what it really boils down to is this isn't climate specific, even though this is our conversation about climate.
Yeah.
It is about the math of predicting the future.
Yeah.
And if we can marry the two, predicting things in the natural world and how they impact things in the financial world, what an incredible use of math and science and all of your investing acumen. So that's what we're getting at here. We are going to work really long and hard in figuring out a good title for this episode, because if it were up to me, it would just be like literally the only conversation you ever need to listen to about math, science, predicting the future, investing, and the world. But this was such a full circle moment for me because Sarah was the woman who encouraged me to consider a job in finance in the first place. And over the past 20 years, we have gone back and forth where it's like, hey, listen, she's in the world of science and thinking about getting back into investing and has talked to me about it. Or I've thought about, hey, listen, I'm exiting my role in finance. What was it like for you when you exited and went back to academia? So like, we have been a sounding board for each other, although you down here are way up here. But I think we always talk about mentorship and the importance of having role models. And Sarah is hands down one of the most impressive people I've ever met in my life. They always say like, don't meet your heroes. But like I had a hero as one of my friends. And so to be able to watch this person grow and change the world and become now one of the leading figures across both science and finance is just so cool to see. And we are so incredibly lucky to have her on. So let's get to it. All right. Well, we are joined here today by the guest that I have been most excited to interview since before we started the podcast. True story. This interview is over 2.5 years in the making. We are joined here today by Sarah Kapnick, who is formerly the chief scientist at NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and is now global head of climate advisory at JPMorgan. But internally here at the Wall Street Skinny, she's known as the godmother of the Wall Street Skinny because Sarah was instrumental in not only mentoring me when I was a freshman and a sophomore at Princeton, but also throughout my finance career. Sarah is literally the reason I got into finance. But Sarah, I'd love if you could tell our listeners who don't know you as well as I do a little bit about who you are and what your career has been, both in climate science and in finance.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that really warm introduction. It is so much fun to finally get to be able to do this with you and have this discussion. So my career is not a straight path, and it really, whenever people ask me this question, I have to go back to what I was doing in college. I went to college because I was a math nerd growing up, and I wanted to be a theoretical mathematician, and so I picked Princeton, and I went there to study math.
I mean, you were basically John Nash. You were Joanne Nash. Like you are a
beautiful mind
prodigy.
Yeah, I went there because of John Nash, and I was obsessed with game theory, and I wanted to be able to learn from him. And I got to sit on his seminars, got to work next to him in the computer lab. But I started doing theoretical math research, and I realized it was so removed for anything in the real world. And actually discussing ideas and discussing findings when I was doing research, I got so excited to go talk to my advisor and said, I made this breakthrough. I found this thing out. Who do we tell? Because only me and the postdoc down the hall know what you're doing. They can understand it. And I realized that I needed to be in a field that had real world applications and implications and action that could come out of it. And so I sometimes joke that I overcorrected and I went into climate science and finance. So I really went into things that I could use my math brain, my math background, and just apply it to different types of puzzles and problems that I saw really interesting. And so I got a finance certificate, which is how we started talking about that in undergraduate days of being in one field, but expanding your mind into finance and applying what you know into the different area that we found super complex and interesting. But then I also started getting into geophysical fluid dynamics, which is a very fancy way of how fluids move, which the atmosphere,
like water, right? Like how water moves around the planet.
Fluid dynamics is like the hardest thing, by the way. Like,
but it's the basis. It's the basis of trading. It's the basis of Black-Scholes. Like fluid dynamics, how gases move is how we actually model a lot of finance.
Wait, really?
Yeah, I didn't know this at all. And I remember taking fluid mechanics in my engineering degree and being like, this is the hardest thing. But that's wild. I never realized that.
I didn't know that fluid mechanics was the basics of Black-Scholes.
Me neither.
Well, Black-Scholes is about how gas move in heat, but it's similar principles about like the movement of things through space and having probabilities about movements and where it's going to go.
Oh yeah, I mean, that makes sense when you say it. Yeah.
So when you were turned off about it, I was like, wow, I can predict the future with this information. And so that really got me hooked on both financial engineering and thinking about the background of how one structured these types of things, but then also how do we predict the future? How do we understand climate and weather? And what are the models for doing so? And then what does that look like going forward? So I got interested in both of those things. And in college, I started exploring it, but I didn't know which path I wanted to go. And I had this dual thinking. And there's even interviews for me in college at the newspaper saying, I'm going to go work for a bit to figure out what I want to do with my life. And then I'm either going to get a PhD, either in economics or in science. I don't know which. And so, like most young people finding themselves, I decided I would go work at Goldman Sachs. And I went into financial institutions group, and I covered insurance, and I worked on cat bonds that we'll talk about later. But it was really because I thought that was the intersection of where some of my interests in climate science and extreme events and weather would intersect with my interest in finance. And I really wanted that real world experience before I went off and did a PhD to be able to anchor my PhD and how people actually use that information.
That is wild, by the way, because we did an early episode interviewing someone who started his career in FIG at Goldman. And he was like, working in FIG is like getting a tattoo on your face, in the sense that it is one of those stamps on your resume that brands you one way. Truly, I've never heard the application of, I'm going to go work in the financial institutions group to benefit my PhD studies. And, when people are typically thinking about these types of entry-level roles in the investment bank at a Goldman Sachs, they're typically thinking, well, what private equity firm am I going to go work for? It isn't typically, how am I going to apply this to an incredibly theoretical advanced degree in, the most complicated things in the world. So I absolutely love this story. And I actually didn't know that that's why.
Actually, one of my closest friends from those years, she got her PhD in international relations and on warlord and diplomacy dynamics and country building post disasters and war in Africa. And understanding how to negotiate things in finance and understanding how people are incentivized or not, and how you structure things like fundamentally changed her also, and then her path towards that. So many of these entry level roles, they just give you so much experience and a piece of how the world operates that you can then take it with you, and then you apply it to many different things. So to go back to the career trajectory question, did that. And it was through doing that I realized that my heart was really in where the science was, about understanding that. Like, that was where my curiosity was starting to develop. And I was structuring catastrophe bonds at the time that Katrina hit. And so I remember having all these questions about climate change and about sea level rise as we were doing that. And where the models were and how they were developed at that time was really backwards looking about data in the past And so it wasn't really incorporating climate science and climate information at a level that I thought it should if you were trying to look at something that had a 3 to 5 year horizon. But I had all these questions. I had all these questions on why you structured it one way or another, how the science came in or didn't. And I remember the Goldman MD at the time. He's like, Sarah, you're here to structure it and sell it and make the pitch books.
Basically, shut up and do the work. Don't ask questions.
And he's like, you're asking all these questions that are not part of our job here. And I remember thinking, like, I am so curious about those questions and no one has the answers for me. Why does no one have the answers? And I couldn't shake that, those questions and that desire to figure out what that meant. And so that drove me to get the PhD in the sciences. And I wanted to understand, why do we know what we know? Where are the gaps in understanding? What's the uncertainty? And what are all the tools available to answer those questions? And so that's why I went deep. And then I got funding from the Department of Energy for a small business innovation research grant to commercialize some of my PhD research. So we had a startup company that forecasted renewable energy output and outage times and damages from extreme weather and climate over a 20 or 30-year time horizon.
Okay.
And we were building it up, but it wasn't a good market fit at the time. People didn't want that level of sophistication. And so built the company, built some of the IP, some of it's still in use today around wildfire prediction. But ultimately I realized this wasn't going to be my next chapter. And so I left the company with my co-founders. And then I decided to embark on a career at NOAA. For almost a decade, I was at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. So I returned back to Princeton to be at the national NOAA lab that was there. And so I got to fundamentally research and do the work on understanding, why do we have extreme events? How are they changing in time? How are they going to change into the future? And actually ask those questions, build the models that can actually answer them, and build the data sets towards doing that. So I got this incredible opportunity to actually really be in charge of building a lot of the things that you need to know to answer all those questions I had. So it was, I asked the questions, got to have this career trajectory, but then I started getting bored because I'm really good at doing this thing and I can do this thing for the rest of my life, but I'm still have all these questions about what's going on in industry and why aren't people using this data?
Yeah.
Why isn't it incorporated into decision making? Because we have all this amazing science over here, but I don't necessarily see industry over here actually using it. And so I first got recruited back by a bunch of different banks, a bunch of different investors to come in to be a science expert for them. And I chose to come to JPMorgan, an asset wealth management business, because I got to see a lot of different things. I got to help work on M&A for asset wealth management. I helped work on building up climate risk analysis for the bank. And I got to sit on some investment committees and advise investors about how to incorporate this information. So I got to this great role where I got to see a lot of stuff and learn, but then also help clients across a wide swath of the bank. And so I did that from 2021 to 2022, and I loved it. But then I got the call back, since I had worked in government and been so senior and developed critical R&D, I got the call of, Sarah, we really need you to come back into government and be the chief scientist of NOAA. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo at the time, she really valued that I was a hardcore scientist that led R&D efforts at NOAA, but also understood commerce and industry and how that information was critical. And she saw that need for someone like me to come in as the White House. And so then I went in and I served for almost 2.5 years. Wow. And then I came back now and I sit in the investment bank. So I've had this career of following the things that I'm really interested in, the problems, but it's always, there's something next that I have to pursue because I reached that limit in whatever role that I'm in.
You remind me so much of Kristen, who kept switching roles within the bank because what she loved most about it was the learning process. Like, okay, this is fun, but I don't actually want to do the job. I want to just learn about the next thing. And so we can relate to that impulse very well. Dumb question. When I was working in an investment bank, I never heard of a global head of climate advisory. And maybe there was one and they just weren't bothering with a little peon like me. Has this role always existed in finance, or is this something relatively new?
Oh, this is something relatively new. And we didn't even know what my title should be when we were coming in. And we threw
so you just made this up on the fly.
But like that is so insane to me because I mean, you look at what's happening with the wildfires, you look at what's happening with these increase in hurricanes. I mean, Jen knows this. I actually, yesterday was my, I don't know, ninth year like wedding anniversary redo because I was supposed to get married in Charleston in 2016 and there was a hurricane that hit that year. And the number of hurricanes and storms and these extreme events, I feel like institutions that have half a brain should be having people like you advising on this stuff. Like this is huge. The amount of money that has to go to rebuilding or to pricing insurance correctly. Like it's wild that there's not more of these types of positions all over the street. But it sounds like to your point, this is new and they literally had to create a title for you, which is wild.
It sounds like having a financial institution that's like, you know what, that 2008 crisis, that was a weird one. Guess that must have been a one-off. Shouldn't learn anything about that.
Well, you talked about insurance, like, and the insurers have had heads of catastrophe risk or chief science roles. And now many of them are evolving to have a lead of climate and catastrophe or chief science officer, many of whom have meteorological or science backgrounds. And it's also not that new at banks in terms of certain desks. So I know that you sat on the sales and trading floor. The commodities desk historically has had meteorologists, particularly in energy and things related to agriculture. And actually, I spent years of my life developing seasonal prediction capabilities because those were funded and there was so much interest in it from the federal government, but also outside to build better forecasts of winter temperatures to be able to predict demand for oil and gas. And it wasn't just in the United States, but there are also times, particularly times of conflict or times of heightened interest, that we would put those seasonal forecasts out and then we would also share them of, this is what the forecast is going to be over this country and this part of the world. And so there's a lot of interest in developing seasonal predictions because it really related to what demand for energy would be. And I also spent time building that out and working with my counterparts at USAID and State Department, because that also predicts food and food production. And if you're an economy that is heavily reliant on agriculture, if you are not producing food in a season because of too much rain, too little rain, too hot, too cold, you won't have food production. And if you only produce your food domestically, that can create famine. It can create economic issues and that can create conflict. So a lot of the underpinning of the science of predicting what comes next has all these different ramifications that can be geopolitical as well as economic. And so it's been on certain trading desks and it's been on certain macroeconomic teams, but it hasn't been the role that I have. And there's different variations of this role now where you have someone who can go in and also talk to corporates and to CEOs and to boards about these issues and about their broader strategy of how they should be integrating in it.
Yeah, I think what's been missing and what certainly I didn't see during my time on the trading desk was, okay, how is this all integrated, right? It's like you might know this really specific thing about, okay, this is going to impact oil production. And so this one desk is going to benefit from this knowledge and these 5 clients who understand this thing so specifically. But how do you think about it as an integrated approach to your entire portfolio? I would argue that was something that was not part of the conversation 10, even 5 years ago, the way that I think it's becoming now. And clearly you're leading the charge on. So I'd love to understand what it is that you're actually doing day to day. Like, how are you translating this climate science for a wealth client or for the CEO of a corporation? Because, I mean, it's very clear from about 30 seconds of talking to you that were you to get into any of the math behind what you do, I wouldn't understand anything about it. And I literally just finished making a module about the Black-Scholes equation. So this is embarrassing. For our listeners who aren't familiar with it, that's kind of one of the fundamental equations that we use in option pricing models. But I would love to understand what you're doing all day, whom you're talking to, and what you're telling them.
Yeah, so my job is because of client demand for climate information. And so I'm here because people want to talk about these issues and think through them. And so I sit in the investment bank. It is a client-facing role. And so my job is to help create content. And I have this climate intuition series where I write periodically on different issues where I think deeply about them and then I put all my words out and thought in a well-constructed manner. It's much more eloquent than I'm able to talk about it when you actually read it. There's a lot of editing that goes in to make it really focused. And so I put that content out because that can anchor all the discussions. And that also is how clients often find me and want to have further discussion. So I put those pieces out, deep thoughts, creating that thought leadership, and then I engage with companies. And it varies based on industry. It varies based on who I'm talking to. Is it a startup? Is it a Fortune 500? Is it a CEO? Is it a board? Is it an ultra high net worth individual in the private bank? It's all about talking to people about the things that they care about and then working through those things they know about the most, and then how it intersects with my thinking and my knowledge about climate to help them think through what does that mean and what are the strategies and what are the actions that should come out of that through that work. So the thought leadership I put out as a starting point for people, and then we can go in depth and have this conversation.
And just really quickly, does Jamie Dimon call you in and like, do you help inform any of the strategy specifically at JPMorgan itself, or it's just client facing? And if it's client facing, it's corporations at the investment bank, or I'm assuming also like the financial sponsors or private equity firms. And do you get brought in with hedge fund services type roles? Is it sort of everybody or just corporations?
I should say it is everybody. I have a really large following in the investor community, and that's because I previously sat in asset and wealth management, and I put out thought leadership when I was here previously to the investor community, and I spoke to them a lot. But it's also these macro level discussions of climate and how it intersects with everything. And also now I'm drawing also from my national security background. Like one of my most recent papers was about the geopolitics of energy, and I wrote it with our new global head of this center for geopolitics. We just stood that up because this trend towards understanding national security is so important. He and I wrote a joint piece actually on that topic. And so investors especially are really curious about these macro trends. And when you start bringing in national security and geopolitics, these things are not normal dollar and cent discussions that financial players are used to having. And some of the behaviors may be counterintuitive to the analysis or modeling you might do financially for short-term basis, but they have these long-term strategic national security goals that hypothetically create and preserve value over years, if not decades.
Can you give us an example of what you mean by that?
Yeah, so right now there's a really big push to support nuclear. And for decades, we have not had new nuclear technologies because it takes many years to build a nuclear plant. They're often extremely expensive. And there's other forms of energy that are cheaper in the here and now. But there's this big push towards nuclear because of national security considerations around demand for AI, and AI being potential future of the economy, but also for self-sufficiency of energy production and baseload power in countries that don't want to be beholden to fossil fuel politics and to trade. And so there's real interest in building out nuclear capabilities and figuring out how to have many different sources of energy now besides fossil fuels that may allow countries to actually generate their own power and no longer be reliant on certain players.
So you're basically saying, here's the cost of this investment up front. Here's what's going to save you because you don't have to go to war with your neighbor over these scarce resources, like to grossly simplify something like that. But those aren't the normal conversations that we're having of like, oh, what's this worth? A couple of basis points on like fives, old fives. Like this is pretty big macro stuff.
Exactly. And those are the conversations that lend themselves on discussions of national security, but also on the climate problems that I often deal with for clients is thinking, how are you positioned many years or many decades? And some leaders or investors are saying, my time horizon is 2 to 4 years. I am hyper focused on that. I'm having a hard time understanding that long term versus that short term, and how do I incorporate those things? And so those are the types of discussions we then have about the things that really matter to them, where we find out, what is your framework for thinking about this? If you really are the short term, maybe there's certain things you need to do now to position yourself 2 years from now when more information comes in, or maybe the market changes, or 4 years from now. And if you don't do that thing right now, you're not going to be well positioned 4 years from now. But maybe there's certain actions you need to take over time, and also like thinking through in normal financial terms, like a hedge against future uncertainty and future information. And so we have these discussions depending on the topic of what that might look like, what that might cost, how one talks to shareholders about that, how you plan for that, how do you even create those plans. Something I pulled from my time in government we've also been having discussions or building up war games around certain issues that might happen in the future to think through how one might react. And often that's also unlocking different ideas, because a lot of these things companies and leaders haven't dealt with before, so they don't really know how to build the plan. But going through one of those exercises can help think through, okay, this is what my plan would be if I was in that moment with no plan. And then maybe I should build a plan now with my smart teams and figure out how I want to be positioned for those types of events or other types of events that I want to think about.
And what are some of those events? I think when we talk about climate risk and finance, some of the typical terms I hear thrown around are things like transition risk and physical risk. I'd love if you could walk us through, like in layman's terms, what those risks are. When we talk about it in vague terms, it's like, well, an asteroid could hit the Earth tomorrow. What's your plan? And you're like, nothing, right? But okay, what are we talking about here when we talk about those different kinds of risks? Can you give us some specific examples?
Yeah, so in short, I want to describe those risks as how companies and individuals may be affected by changes in the world brought about by climate change, either indirectly through changes in behavior or directly from the wrath of Mother Nature. So transition risk is that financial risk from changes in behavior. So these are the shifts that you might get from policies or regulation or technologies or consumer and market preferences as people try to reduce further climate change from happening by reducing the buildup of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So like the very simple example of that is shifting from burning coal to shifting to building of nuclear power. But it can also take the form of we are going to think through building materials and the life cycle of emissions of building materials and what those emissions are. And we're going to shift from certain practices to others, which then that's how construction is done. It's time it takes to do construction. Are you doing recycling? What types of materials are you doing? Are you using tried and true for thousands of years concrete in its historic form? Or are you working with some of the startups and the groups that have new forms of concrete that can have lower carbon emissions over time? And then on physical risk, so that financial risk from the wrath of Mother Nature. I was trying to think of a way to say this that can really stick in your mind.
It sounds dramatic. You're doing a great job.
So that one is how climate change can increase the probability or severity of extreme events like rainfall and heat waves. And those things, they damage property, they hurt crops, they bring construction to a halt. So it's thinking through what are those things that actually cause financial damages. Physically, you can often see them. And it also relates to these slow rising damages that can happen due to climate change over time. So there's these fast events and extreme events, but there's also these slow rising financial damages that you see as climate change happens gradually. And so those are examples like sea level rise slowly swallows up coastal properties, or this is an issue that I think people are going to become more aware of in the next couple of years. You actually also, because of sea level rise, you have pressure from the ocean, from salt water into underground aquifers. And so that salt water slowly seeps into those underground aquifers and wells, making them salty and then rendering them useless. And actually,
so should we all be investing in like desalinization tools?
Are the aquifers that what holds the water, like drinking water?
Yeah, the drinking water underground. And actually, I used this example recently with someone, and they're like, "Oh, that's why I had to move my well in Martha's Vineyard back."
That's such an ultra high net worth conversation. I don't even know where to begin. My well at my Martha's Vineyard estate. I love it.
Yeah, but they were like, oh, we had to move it across the road instead of on the other side because they were telling us that there was rust in the well and that the water quality wasn't good anymore. But so there's these gradual changes, and sometimes with that example, especially, like people aren't necessarily aware that those gradual changes are happening or they're changing due to climate change, or that there may be things that they need to start thinking about what to do about that. And again, in that like personal property example, if you have that property that is so close to the coastal zone, you're relying upon that water from your well. At a certain point, if you don't have within your property that location where you can actually drill a well for fresh water, you're then thinking about desalination. You're then thinking about do I need to have an agreement with my neighbor that I can access water from them?
Yeah.
Like,
Or
I need
do
an
I
easement on your property. This is wild.
And for me, I grew up in a part of the Midwest where we had sewer systems of water treatment because it's very focused on because of the watershed with the Great Lakes. But here on the East Coast, parts of the South, even parts of the West Coast, people have well water. Even in developed areas, they have septic tanks. They have these exposures to the coastal zone that could affect property values. So transition risk, that's changes in behavior, and changes in behavior that may come about through policy changes or preferences, like how society starts thinking about these problems and dealing with them. So there's some uncertainty of when those occur, and you're kind of predicting them based on policy expectations or based on human behavior and responses to these things. And as a physical scientist, I find those are harder to predict and understand how those will unfold. The
You mean
physical
humans
risk,
don't always act rationally in the face of scientific data?
yeah, then you have the physical risk information where we know the information. And so we also know how that's going to start unfolding. There's still a lot of science developed around that, but we have some idea of where the future is headed due to that physical risk. And exactly what you're saying, Jennifer. Yeah, we don't know how people are going to respond to that, even with the best of information. And so for business leaders, as you're thinking about these different types of risks and thinking about how you incorporate them, you have to have some views of the human behavior and responses to these different types of things. But then also critically, since I'm on your podcast, you have to be thinking about how the markets are going to start incorporating them or pricing them or not over time. And a lot of my discussions, I ask the people that I'm talking to, like, what is your opinion of this? Because I can give you the facts and science, but you have to have some opinions about how the markets will respond, how people will respond, how investors are going to be interested or not in these types of issues over time.
Well, it's wild. I mean, I think it's so interesting. I mean, this is personal, like seeing how my parents behave because I think it was like in 2009, they took their retirement money and they were like, you know what, we're going to use it to buy real estate in Florida. And they have a condo. And I keep telling them, sell it, like get out. Like, what are you doing? Last year, there was like 2 or 3 hurricanes that hit them in the course of 1 year. And I was like, just like leave. And they're like, no, no,
And your dad like went down to
so
Florida during Hurricane Milton to like
right. Well, because he went down after they got hit the first time, and their car was flooded, so they were able to like get a new car. And while he was there was another hurricane that was supposed to hit them dead on, and he decided to stay and like camp out. And I was just like, get rid of this property. Like, what are you doing? Put it in fixed income and like be safe about this. And instead, they're just like, it's going to be fine. And I think that it just sort of speaks to some of the irrationality. And also for people, especially if like they don't have an option to just like move. I mean, my parents are very fortunate. They own a place here near us in Massachusetts. So like for them, they can sell. But a lot of people, they don't necessarily have that option. And we saw this with the wildfires in California where their whole life savings was in their house and the house burned down and they didn't have insurance because the insurance pulled out. And it's just like, I think it's one of these things where people can know the rational, like you should move or you should do XYZ thing. But especially in California, I mean, I feel like because of some of the tax incentives, people are very incentivized to stay where they are. And so I think that this is such an interesting conversation. But to your point, you can have the perfect rational idea about you should do this, you should get out. And it's like, well, no, I mean, it's been fine in the past, so it'll be fine in the future. And it's like, but until it's not.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great segue to our next topic, which full disclosure, I came on here with an agenda because I first learned about catastrophe bonds, cat bonds, which we mentioned very early on in this conversation. I think from you, Sarah, because I think you were doing modeling that went into these bonds and you explained them to me in layman's terms. And I was like, this is the coolest thing. Why isn't everybody invested in these things? How do they work? And you're like, well, it's a little more complicated than that. So I'd love it if we could get into cat bonds, what they are, how they work, and how do they differ from more vanilla debt instruments and kind of insurance-linked securities that we've talked about here before?
Yeah, so it was my first finance love as a summer analyst. I think that's why you remember talking about it. And I'll say, I am not structuring them right now. This is something though that is a growing trend that we need to be aware of with rising potential for extreme events and for both the probability and the magnitude of those events, because it's this dynamic that is leading to some interest in these types of bonds. So it comes up in any discussion about extreme weather, catastrophe, and insurance. So a cat bond, CAT stands for catastrophe. And so it is the transfer of a specific set of risks. So, for example, hurricanes, earthquakes. In Europe, they have windstorms that are super damaging, or a flood event. And that transfers that risk from an insurer or a reinsurer to investors in the capital markets. So when
so kind of like a credit default swap, but for weather.
Exactly. For that wrath of Mother Nature.
The wrath of Mother Nature. That's my new favorite term.
And they're structured in such a way that you're identifying what events that cat bond is going to cover. And it can be many of them, or it can be focused on one. And it's when that specific event occurs above a predefined threshold. So you set that threshold, we say like the wind speeds of a certain amount, or flooding of a certain level, or category 3 hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
That threshold, once it's passed, it leads to a triggering event. Mm-hmm. And then that triggering event leads to a portion or all of the bond principal goes to the insurer or reinsurer to pay their claims. Mm-hmm. And for this risk of this principal, investors receive an interest payment from the sponsor, and it's often high yield. And so that's why there's been an attractiveness around this. So it's not vanilla debt instrument, it's higher interest rates. And also these trigger events, they're non-market-based risks. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of interest in these from investors that want that non-market risk associated with it. Mm-hmm. And they do this because they're often very sophisticated. They often have large portfolios, and they want to have that as part of their overall risk profile. They want to be able to put this in. And especially in times like right now, where you have inflation uncertainty, you have interest rate uncertainty, you have potential of geopolitics, there's interest in these non-traditional investment vehicles to be able to build out that whole portfolio of risk.
You've mentioned reinsurers. What is the difference between like an insurer and a reinsurer? What is that?
So a reinsurer gives insurance to an insurer.
Got it.
So it's called reinsurance when they're giving it to the insurer.
Got it. So you have like
there's these different levels of risk transfer, because you can write all the policies, but at a certain point, as you're doing the analysis, new information comes in, you may have too much risk on your balance sheet, and so you then transfer that to someone else. So the insurers can transfer that to the reinsurance, and both the insurers and the reinsurers can transfer that to the capital markets through this vehicle or other types of insurance-linked securities. And so a cat bond is an insurance-linked security, and there are many other types of insurance-linked securities. And really the whole premise of all of those is taking something that relates to insurance and putting that risk or the rewards into the capital markets, so it's off the balance sheet of that financial institution.
And you talked about the specific triggers. So I think one of the things that's so interesting about cat bonds is they're kind of notorious for being squirrely, if you will. That, okay, here's our trigger. It's not just an earthquake hits and there's a tsunami. It's that the tsunami has to be a, water wall of at least 16 feet. And if it's 15 feet and 11 inches, and if it hits the coastline, oh, but not the coastline in that area, the coastline in this area, and whatever. And so there's this kind of perception that cat bonds actually don't pay out because these triggers have been crafted in such a way that they basically don't happen, versus, again, the credit default swap analogy that I use, which is like, okay, they miss a coupon payment, you're done, right? Like, it's triggered, it's very vanilla. Can you talk a little bit about the process of crafting those triggers and how it is or isn't done with some of this scientific knowledge on either side? I imagine you kind of have like, okay, I want the best and brightest scientists on my team so I can come up with designing this thing optimally so that it either does or doesn't have a higher likelihood of paying out.
Yeah, and so this goes back to why sophisticated investors often buying these things, and also why I was asking so many questions when I was working on the structuring, is that there's a lot of science that goes into this. And you have to trust the modeling, you have to trust the data going into that modeling, you have to trust both historic analysis of these types of events to be able to understand how do you structure it based on those expectations and probabilities of these types of events happening. But then you also have to have a forward-looking viewpoint of, if all that backward information, particularly with a a background of climate change continuously happening. And it may be linear, it may be nonlinear. Is the quantification of risk that you have from past data representative of what the current risk is? And if the lifetime of this thing is 3 to 5 years, is it representative? And do you need to have a different view of what the risk is over the next 3 to 5 years that incorporates other types of information? And so you have people that are meteorologists, you have engineers, you have climate scientists that go into the data and information and the structuring of those catastrophe models to make those determinations and help structure them. And then on the other side, with these investors, many have scientists on their teams that also are doing that analysis. And so then they have a viewpoint of what is the likelihood of these types of events happening in the next couple of years? And is that high coupon payment high enough that should there be a triggering event that I lose part of my principal, does it still make financial sense for me to invest in these things? And then they're also weighing that against, do I think that these will be important to have if I think there's going to be something coming out of the Fed and I think my other debt instruments won't make as much, or something's going to happen in the public markets that I'm concerned about, or do I want this 3 to 5 year duration asset because I don't want to have private credit or something else. So there's all these weighing factors that the investors then are looking at as they're going into this. And speaking to many of them, they're some of the most sophisticated people on weather and climate. And they always have a ton of questions for me when I was both as the chief scientist of NOAA and then now when I'm back in the bank around these issues and how I'm thinking. And they always have like a new model. They're like, we have this new AM model for seasonal prediction in the next few years. We have this new viewpoint. What's your thought? So there's a lot that goes into this.
What are you looking at? So I'm so curious because you talked about your time like in the lab at Princeton. Like I used to text you and you were like, I'm in the back of you see like in Mission Impossible, you're like, I'm in a cargo plane coming back from Greenland or whatever it is. Got to text you later. You were boots on the ground doing this hard science for so long. Now you're sitting in the newly minted JPMorgan headquarters, but like, what are you looking at now? Do you have access to that same level of information? Are you building your own new models? Are you talking to the lab? Are you out taking samples in the glacial ice? How are you now doing this analysis now that you're not in the hard science role, if you will?
Yeah, the saddest part about my job right now is I don't get to go on glaciers or on ships as much as I used to. And I actually said that at a port conference and immediately was offered a tour of the New York Harbor. But so now I'm pulling all the information that I have available through public data sets, but then also doing data buys from all the data providers as well as startup groups that are starting to develop that I think have interesting data or insights that I'm pulling in. You can actually go and read my pieces through the Climate Intuition series and see what data I'm starting to pull in.
Is that available to the public? Yeah. Anyone can go access those?
Anyone can go find it. If you search Climate Intuition and Kapnick, you will find it on the JPMorgan website. There's an insights page, and everything that has the Climate Intuition branding is the stuff that I've been writing.
Is it like a newsletter?
Yeah, I have a subscribe link, and we can make sure that we send it to you guys afterwards.
We'll put that link in the show notes here as well.
Yeah, so if you subscribe, it comes directly to your email inbox. But then it's also available on the public-facing JPMorgan website, so it's also findable. And it often also gets picked up in the media. And so people either find it, they're in the inside and they get the first draft as it comes out, or they see it in one of the iterations on social or on media or somewhere later on. But from there, you can actually see what my sources of information are. It's like very clear where I'm drawing all this information. And some of it is coming from the public sources. Some of it is coming from very specific groups. And I'm going out and I'm trying to find the best information or representative information. I try to be careful and say, this is a representative analysis from this data set. And then I'm still pulling from basic scientific principles and the latest in scientific research and reports that are coming out. And I'm trying to help people make sense of them. And I write the series also based on all the questions I'm getting from clients. So as I'm traveling around the world and having discussions or traveling from my desk on Zoom, I get all these questions about climate and about issues for companies, but often it's first time someone's ever talked to a climate scientist. And so people will have, when I'm in person, sometimes it's actually a physical copy with a paperclip. I'm like, I just read this in XYZ media thing. Can you walk me through it?
Yeah.
What does this mean? Is this real? what would it take for us to understand something differently, and how should I be thinking about it?
What are
And
the
so
biggest misunderstandings? Like, what do you think people are getting wrong?
there's a really fundamental one that I am regularly surprised about. I put it in my paper on building resilience through climate adaptation. I'm thinking I'm going to bring it back for another future one, of the difference between annual risk and cumulative risk over time. It's a really important concept that I deal with on the physical risk side. So to flesh it out for you, we have these common names for like floods, 1 in 100 year event.
Oh yeah. Oh God. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, where they are like, it's another 1 in 100 year flood. I'm like the one last month?
Yep. Yep.
Exactly. So when people hear that, you think, oh, I just had it. I'm good for 99 more years. And that's actually not what it means. A 1 in 100 year event is kind of the common name that people use, but it means that there's a probability in any given year of 1% chance of that happening. Even if an event has a 1% chance of happening every year, once you move into these cumulative ranges of like thinking about it over 5 years or over 30 years, over 5 years, a 1% chance happening every year has a 4.9% chance of happening. Over 30 years, it has a 26% chance of happening. So if you think about a 30-year mortgage, and when people are hearing about 1 in 100 year events, they're like, that's not going to happen. In my lifetime of owning this property, I'm fine. But actually, you're taking the odds on a 26% chance that you're going to have a 1 in 100 year event hit you. And even
basic math that like literally no one thinks through.
Yeah.
And really quickly, is that 1 in 100 is going up? Like, I assume just given everything going on with climate change, does that 1 in 100 look forward or is that backward looking? I mean, my in-laws live in South Carolina and it's the same thing. It's like every year there's that 100. I'm like, well, now it's probably 1 in 10. Or is that just my inability to understand cumulative risk? And it's really still the 1 in 100. It's the cumulative effect of it.
Oh, that's the A+ question because those people don't start connecting. So those numbers that I just gave you, that is in a static climate.
That's a static environment, right? Where nothing changes. Yeah.
Static environment where nothing's changing. And so depending on the peril, you can have that risk actually increasing over time, and it may not be linear, it may be exponential, it may also for certain things be going down. And so actually if you have all the climate information that you're incorporating, you can also quantify what that looks like over that 30-year time period. But that's where these things really break down. So it breaks down when people try to take the 1 in 100 year event and move it to a 30-year likelihood. But then it really breaks down when you go from there to then trying to quantify it under climate change, because that requires actually bringing in climate information and expectations about what the forward looks like. And once you go out 2 to 3 decades, you need to also have a view on what are the emissions in the atmosphere, so how much climate change will happen, because that also leads to a spread at the 30-year time point. And so you have to have a bunch of these decisions and thoughts and opinions about what are you trying to quantify, and like what ranges you want to quantify of uncertainty and what uncertainties to then get to those numbers. And so that level of deeper thinking and analysis that needs to take place is what I spend a lot of my time doing, but is also, I think, where it's deeply misunderstood about how to do this type of work, which is why there are gaps in different behaviors and also potentially things not being priced into all markets because that type of analysis hasn't taken place yet, because we've been so used to a lot of the modeling and a lot of the thinking is looking at the past and looking at data of the past to create our views of the future.
Right. Well, and I was also curious, when you're putting these models together, how much of it changes with politics? Not to get political at all, but it's just like different administrations and then different foreign leaders are going to have different policies. Does that go into these prediction models? I assume these are just these insane models that have so many different assumptions that are trying to come up with what the risk assessment is in the future.
Yeah. So you drive a climate model, which is like the physics of the atmosphere and the ocean, with a view of what the emissions into the atmosphere are. So you have to have a view of what that trajectory is and a view of those politics, then drive some of those outputs that you get on the physical side. So you have to have a view of the emissions and what potential future emissions are and all the policies that get you there to then be able to model out what it looks like. And there are swings in these things. And I will say that different groups around the world have very different views about how to approach this problem. And what I also find fascinating in my job is sitting down with these different groups, why they think the way that they do, understanding that, and then figuring out how to translate what that means and what the actions need to be. And there are different pockets around the world of different types of thinking, but the baseline of what everyone is trying to do is make sense of the future world with probabilities around climate to make some decisions that they need to make today.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about trying to quantify the level of future emissions as kind of a baseline. And I think one of the things that I'm so curious to understand is when you're quantifying that, obviously you probably have some toggle in your model where you're like, okay, next administration is Republican or Democrat or whatever it is, right? Like I'm sure there's much more nuanced stuff that goes into it. But also, how do you factor in the balance between government regulation being the future determinant of those emissions and private sector innovation? Where you were talking about AI built models and stuff like that, but also thinking about all the different clean energy startups, right? How do you incorporate the risk, if you will, although it sounds like a positive risk, that, hey, somebody figures out the formula for cold fusion, and next thing you know, we've all got flying cars that emit nothing or whatever it is. Like, how do you factor in the risks into your model around private sector innovation in addition to potential government regulation saying net zero or whatever it is?
Yeah, I love the way that you're thinking there. And I think sometimes also removing from discussion about climate helps take some of the emotions out of some of the discussion because people gets emotive on the politics on some of the other trajectory pieces of how one thinks about that. And the question that you're asking right now really relates to what are the disruptive technologies that fully change your viewpoint and also might be market changing. So exactly, fusion is one of those market changing technologies. But I grew up in Illinois where if you were really good in math and science, a lot of people wanted to do nuclear engineering. And I have always been fascinated by nuclear engineering and nuclear companies. And right now in the United States, we have a couple of fusion companies, and there's one that has raised the most money and is actually building out their prototype in Commonwealth Fusion. And you have some fusion technologies being built out in China. There was also just a recent announcement that scientists across China and Europe are trying to share more information on fusion, this idea that you need the collaborative team effort. And so also it's really interesting because groups are partnering now that were not partnering previously.
Yeah, that's surprising.
Well, sorry, this is like a pause, but like I learned this and I always forget it. Fusion is where you are putting the atoms together and it creates the most amount of energy versus we can do fission right now, correct? And like, can you just quantify the magnitude of the additional energy you could get if you were able to do fusion versus fission? I just think like these like hard data points, I've heard this before and I forget the numbers, but it like really hits home why that would be such a big deal.
The way to think about it is fusion is like the power of the sun, where you have a reaction that you set off and then it takes energy in, but then it creates more energy out. And like the big milestone that happened at the Berkeley lab, at the DOE lab a couple of years ago, it was the first time for a very short period of time that they had a reaction where they put the energy in, they got more energy out. With fission, which we've had for decades, you need that radioactive source. You have uranium, plutonium, which then you are putting the radioactive material together. It sets off a chain reaction. That chain reaction is leading to energy out, but it is a fuel that is driving it. And once that fuel runs out, you have no more energy. And so the idea, though, with figuring out fusion is that you could potentially have this unlimited source of energy once you start developing it out. And the science, actually the engineering and making that a controlled reaction and making it work would probably limit certain amounts of energy that's come out, but it would be that energy in perpetuity that would only be limited by the lifetime of all the materials holding that reaction together.
That is insane.
And so there's an idea that as a disruptive technology that could bring down the cost of energy and it could be put in certain locations. And then you have that energy source that you are now self-sustaining in that place for whatever period of time. limited by those materials.
We also have the scenario where, if you guys have seen Oppenheimer, it's like,
Yeah.
or there's about to be a black hole that follows the Earth. Like, no big deal. Either
Like
way,
the
a
atmosphere is
binary outcome.
Yeah. It's one of those disruptive technologies, though. A couple decades ago, when you would talk to the nuclear engineers, they were like, this is around the corner. And so for some investors, they're like, it's always around the corner. But from a science and tech standpoint, there have been major milestones that have been reached. And now these commercial enterprises have received a ton of funding and are building it out in the US and abroad. And there's a ton of government support in China. There's also been a couple $1 billion announcements out of Germany of trying to support these things. And it's really because there's investment and interest in this potential for massively disruptive technology.
By the way, I just wanted to put an exclamation mark on that, because you hear so many people say that with AI, we need to beat the arms race with China, blah, blah, blah. And it sounds like, to your point, here on the fusion side, we actually are all starting to work together.
There has been separate activities that are very much government centric, but there's this new goal of trying to share more of the information that's coming out of that. And we saw that with the development of EVs. Tesla was really front on making available IP and information, so it was open source, so it could be used. They had the protections around it, but there was the thesis that that could lead to faster innovation in space. That's kind of underpinning this open science idea with that specific area of fusion of, there's questions we have that you could unlock further if you create it more. And we remain to be seen how long that lasts. And if it becomes a national security issue, that science becomes less open. But we're years or decades from being able to build those types of things. And there's a bunch of science and tech milestones that need to take place. The technology and the energy side that I see that people are most excited about right now that has that unlocking potential is geothermal. That now we can drill wells much deeper, much faster, much cheaper than in the past. That's unlocking geothermal potential, but then also from fracking in the natural gas industry, they can now also drill horizontally to the geothermal wells. So one well can also be more effective because it can be horizontal as well.
And can you just, so when you say geothermal, you mean like basically trying to get oil or anything? Heat, got it. Geothermal, sorry.
Yeah. It's taking oil and gas industry tech and applying it to harnessing energy of the fact that it gets hotter with depth.
We have a hot core in the center of our Earth, and if we could use that heat to to power all our stuff. It's kind of funny because it always reminds me of Armageddon. I don't know if you guys ever saw that movie back in the day, but it's like, rather than training a bunch of astronauts to drill, let's train a bunch of drillers to be astronauts to save the world. But I mean, I do think that it's really interesting that technology that was so controversial, if you will, like fracking, is now at the heart of some of the greener technology potentially going forward.
Agreed.
No, and I apologize. It's funny. Like, I hear a lot of these terms, and even geothermal. I was like, wait a second, I've heard that before, but what does it mean?
I feel like we're talking about so many potential positive developments. What keeps you up at night? If you're like, oh God, like I'm going to bed and I wake up at 1 a.m. in a cold sweat about something when it comes to climate change or risks that people don't understand, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, people ask me this all the time. They're like, let me know into your deep recesses of your soul and all that stuff that you used to work on that you can't talk about in government. For me, it's actually a very personal question of, am I using my time effectively on these problems? So as I was joking, as a climate scientist, I've lived in many different worlds in the future where I've thought about it from like, what do hurricanes look like? What does food production look like? What does conflict look like? My partners in the State Department and elsewhere. So I've thought about all these different worlds, but then I've also thought about what are all the solutions that we have today, and can we actually yield it effectively and bring it into use? And so I think a lot about, am I in that intersection with my skill set, making sure that that's being unlocked as much as possible in what I'm doing?
Like, are you leaving the optimal legacy sitting in this role versus potentially being the one out there making the change from a policy standpoint, or being the investor who's building the company or whatever it is?
I mean, just as an outsider, to me, the answer is yes. And it goes back to kind of that anecdote that you shared about like, oh my God, I just found this amazing thing. Who do I tell? And you're like, you go tell the guy down the hall. And it's like, I think that Jen and I, when we first started doing this, it would be like, how do we get someone excited about duration? And it's like, we try to like position it in this way. And it's like, the sad thing is at the end of the day, people care about stuff when there's money involved. And so I feel like, honestly, the seat that you're in, where it's like, how can we position this so that whether you're like a new startup trying to create whatever clean concrete, clean XYZ thing, you know, you're solving cold fusion. Like, I think at the end of the day, when you get money involved, things become more sexy and exciting. And I do think you then reach the maximum amount of people. Whereas back to the point, you could obviously solve the whole thing, but you have to get the word out. It's like, people need to know about this. And I feel like you are doing this amazing job. So I just want to add that little anecdote. Again, who am I to say like whatever, but it is so clear to me that like you are.
No, Kristen, I think you're right. I mean, even just that story you told about the person who's worried about their well water on Martha's Vineyard. It's like people care when it's about them. It's really hard to constantly go through life with this big, noble vision and be like, I want the earth to be great for all these people in the future. We have to reconcile that with human nature. And if it doesn't impact you today, it's really hard to think about what's going to impact the future humanity. God knows what they look like in 50 years. And I think sitting at the intersection of the two of like, what are you doing today to make your Martha's Vineyard property much nicer in a way that yields future positive results for other people is a win-win. And it's just realistic about how human nature works versus having your head in the sand and being like, God, I just wish everyone were more altruistic.
And I have to say one more thing. Like when Jen initially was like, we're going to talk about climate science, I was like, oh gosh, what is, and listening to this, I'm like, this is the coolest thing. Why did I not go into climate?
Yeah,
like,
this is what got me into
cool.
finance because Sarah told me what she was doing. Let me explain, guys. Like Sarah was my big sister in my sorority who was like, you need to stop going out and getting wasted every night and thinking about writing the great American novel and like maybe get a job. And she told me what she was doing in finance. And I was like, this sounds interesting. This intersection of science and storytelling and irrational human behavior and all these things that we were doing during your summer internship, structuring cap-ons. I know it's not what you're doing now, but I was like, that sounds so freaking cool. Little wannabe astrophysicist over here was like, oh my God, there's so much to think about or whatever. And I got sucked down the black hole of fixed income and here I am today. But I really do credit you above all others. I mean, maybe my like parents excluded for making finance sexy. And it was through this intersection with the scientific and with like the real world applications of finance. That was my gateway drug that got me in. And so I'd love it if you could speak a little bit about mentorship as you see it, as someone who was such a guiding light for me. And you are so inspirational. And I think there's a reason why JPMorgan is creating roles for you. It's like, just get this woman in a seat and like, let her cook. And I'm really curious, thinking about the next generation coming up behind you, a generation that is so much more savvy about a lot of these things, who has had climate on their radar pretty much since birth. Like, what advice would you give to young, curious people out there who are considering a career in finance or might be a scientist or whatever it is? Like, if you could go back and do it all over again, what would you tell the 19-year-old Sarah Kapnick at Princeton studying under John Nash? Like, what would you tell her today?
Yeah, I would say figure out what you're curious about and then find those jobs that allow you to learn a ton, both in terms of like facts and stuff, but also skill sets and different types of skill sets, because that's what will keep your interest. But then also you keep moving when you stop learning. And I think that's a really important thing. And it's the people that really have these really rich careers that I see now at higher levels are the ones that have done that over time. They followed those passions and those interests, and then they cobble it together. And it all makes sense when you look back on one's career, but when it's happening,
it's like, duh, you were clearly destined to do this.
When it's happening, it's chaos. Like, I remember when I left Goldman Sachs, my dad was like, are you sure you haven't just thrown away your life?
Oh my goodness.
And he was like very serious. He was very concerned about me going to be, he's like, you're going to go do a PhD and they barely give you a stipend to live off of. What are you thinking? I was like, well, I had that job, so I'll be okay for the next few years and then we'll see. But I think my career makes total sense now looking back at it. But during the time, I was really just following those different areas of the things I was passionate about and I was interested in. And it's allowed me to build this career, but also take the risks and have the conviction to shift when I was no longer learning enough. And I realized I needed a different challenge in a new place. And for my role now, that's what makes me unique and has people wanting to talk to me is that they need some new information. They need this injection of new thinking. And that's, what I find so invigorating. And I hadn't thought about it until today, but it's basically going back to college and being like, you can only talk to the person down the hall. I get to talk to everyone all around the world now. And
it's the best.
whoever wants to talk, we get to talk.
It's the best.
Sorry, really fast. If there's like someone who's a youngin who wants to follow in your footsteps, like, would you recommend, like, if they're like, I want to be Sarah Kapnick one day, would you recommend a PhD? And by the way, do you have analysts who work under you, or are you kind of like just the advisor who doesn't need pitch decks done and stuff? Like, can someone work with you? Can people like apply to go?
Can Kristen come work for you?
Yeah, can work? Can people apply to like go into JPMorgan and work under you?
So I get to work with analysts across the entire firm, particularly in investment banking and actually also the commercial bank, because the work that I do requires that collaboration across. And I actually climate advisory sits vertical under corporate advisory. And so I work really closely across all of corporate advisory. And so there are some analysts that I've worked with the most that have done repeat papers with me and then repeat clients with me. But I also get to work broadly. And so coming into the bank, and I think any bank for this matter, and any type of job in corporate America, you're starting to see that every job has a climate aspect of some sort. And you need to have some thinking around this. And so it's really, how do you bring that in as you build that skill set in whatever seat that you're in and bringing it in? Like in my discussions in my travels, I've been struck, particularly in the real estate industry, people that I thought were buttoned up real estate investors or operators have extensive knowledge about climate change and are thinking about it in terms of their climate adjusted return profiles. And they have sophistication in it in ways that I never thought they would. They probably didn't have this 10 or 20 years from now, but they do now because of the realities of the investment. And as you said, Jen, about where you're making money and how you need to be thinking. And so it's changing the way that everyone is talking about it. And from my work now, I get to talk to every single sector about this. And so it comes up everywhere in every corner of the globe. And so for people that are really interested in it, I think find the jobs that puts together your interests and has the jobs that are interested in day to day to you, but then also build those skill sets and follow those curiosities of the latest in science and engineering and how it applies, have some awareness of the policy, and you can craft those jobs around all of that.
I have a personal question. I mean, you're one of the most senior women on Wall Street, period, full stop. Your husband is a partner at a law firm and you have 2 young children. I mean, I can barely handle my workload and I work for myself and, Kristen and I make our own hours. I cannot imagine what the demands are on your life. How do you get it all done? Like, how do you do it? Do you have an army of help? I'm legitimately curious because I think it's really important to have these conversations about what it actually looks like for you to be a parent in this incredibly successful role and in the roles that you've been in over time, which required you sitting in a cargo plane on a glacier or whatever it is. Like, how do you make it all happen?
So number one, a amazing partner in my husband. Because I've had a really hard travel schedule, even when I was in government as a government researcher and then the chief scientist. I had an awful travel schedule. I was gone all the time.
Yeah.
And so I had to have partnership with him on like making that all work for our household and with our kids. And even before we even had kids, I had to travel a lot and I had just the support of someone who also had ambition and shared a love of my ambition, so propelled me forward. And now, it's a balance. Thankfully, my kids love after school at their school because they're like, I don't want to stay at home. I want to go do things and learn things and take a pottery class or take coding. So they have after school, and we also have childcare for when we need to fill in those gaps. Sometimes both of us travel. Recently, I had to go overseas, and I had to go to London. My husband had to go to California, and luckily, we have grandparents that have moved close by, so they just take a train into the city and are with their grandkids. So we're lucky that those times have matched up. And it is a constant renegotiation and discussion and thinking through how to make it all work. And there have been times, like particularly during COVID when there was no childcare.
Oh my God, you and I were texting back and forth, like, how are we surviving right now?
Yeah, and I think back, I remember my husband saying to me at the time, because I was so stressed out because I wasn't working as much. And he was like, everyone's not working as much. But also, he's like, this is a short period of time and do what you can to keep things moving. And then when the time gets easier, then you run. And so during those different times, there's family health or whatever that you can't go full steam. So you don't. And then when you have those times that you can and everything lines up perfectly, you just go.
Well, I think it's also really telling that you said you were stressed out from not working as much. And I think that's counterintuitive to a lot of people and speaks to the type of work ethic and personality that you need to have. That the idea of sitting still makes you antsy. And you're like, no,
Oh, yes.
I need to be doing something else. I need to be doing more. I think some people, people always talk about the dream of retirement. We always joke that like, that's our worst nightmare because like, what would we do with ourselves? So we make our lives harder by adding more things into them, but it's objectively more fulfilling. And I think that's part of why you've been so successful.
I agree. And I get to follow my interest and curiosity and have amazing conversations with my clients worldwide and learn something every single day. And it would be boring if I didn't get to do any of this.
There is nothing boring about you or your life or your career. Well, Sarah, again, we are so grateful for you. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Thank you for making this happen. And thank you for being such a supportive voice as I've gone through this journey, as we've built this entire business. I mean, we wanted you to be our first podcast guest, but to be honest, I think the quality of interview we're able to have with you now is so superior. So I thank you to JPMorgan for making this happen. Thank you to you. And if our listeners want to read more, we've got the Climate Intuition series on JPMorgan's website. We'll put a link to subscribe to that. Where else can our listeners find you if they want to learn more about you or potentially interact with you?
Well, my LinkedIn's public. They can go find it. And
Fabulous.
That's where I put updates on things that I've spoken about at different conferences, or my writing also goes on there and all the media that I do. And I have lived a public official life. So I'm very findable as a result. But I have to say, thank you so much for having me on. It's incredible what you guys have built in terms of educating people broadly and bringing it with authenticity. And I think that's why people listen to you and are drawn in. And I really look forward to seeing what you guys are going to do for the next 2 and change years and beyond. With this
well, you're the best, Sarah. Thank you so much.
This was my favorite conversation. Just for
I
the record.
told you it'd be awesome.